Good morning. I'm Ruth Stevens, and I'm glad that you're joining me today to learn more about images from the women's suffrage movement. This presentation grew out of my research on Michigan and Grand Rapids women's suffrage that was done in conjunction with the Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council. Our work on the local and state suffrage movements started in the run-up to 2020, the anniversary of the 100th anniversary of when women across the country got the right to vote. And we have an exhibit on our website that we would love to have you look at if this talk piques your interest about the suffrage movement. And in this talk, I'm going to be combining a discussion of some of the key events in the suffrage movement, just to give you some context, with sharing some images that I think are very significant to the movement, either because they're representing key historical moments during the women's suffrage movement, or simply because of the images themselves, the evocative nature, the beauty, the cleverness of some of them. So I think you'll see that over the course of the women's suffrage movement, there was a lot of creativity put into influencing men who were the voters at that time to support women's suffrage through print materials. I'm going to disappear for a minute so that you can see all of the slides and, well, more than a minute actually. And then I will reappear at the back at the end of the talk. Let's start by looking at an overview of suffrage memorabilia. The last decade of the suffrage movement, roughly 1910, to 1920, but you can see stretching a little bit before that, what is called the golden age of suffrage memorabilia. This slide gives some examples of the types of memorabilia from the movement. You can see that there are a number of physical objects as well as printed objects. So we have some examples here: buttons that were commonly used in suffrage campaigns, a poster of Inez Milholland Bossevane, which is an iconic image. We'll see a photo of the real event that this poster is based on, then a pennant, a sash, and we can see with the four girls on the upper right that we have a full outfit with sash, wearing white, and also their votes for women bags. One other thing I want to mention, just because of the Grand Rapids connection, and I have not been able to locate a picture of this, and it is miniature Bissell carpet sweepers that were created in Grand Rapids in 1899 when the National American Woman Suffrage Association gathered in Grand Rapids. These were a gift from Anna Bissell, and they were marked with the name of the organization. I'll shorthand it and say NASA. It was the main suffrage organization in the United States, or pro-suffrage organization at the time. And each delegate to the 1899 National NASA Convention in Grand Rapids got a miniature carpet sweeper to take home. And then later, Bissell printed a suffrage fan. We have never been able to locate one of these carpet sweepers. There would not be of that many of them made. So if you come across one, please let me know. It's probably a very valuable souvenir. So let's start with some background just to give context to what we're talking about here. It's hard to put exact dates on the women's suffrage movement, but many people mark the start of the movement at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. This was a convention organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, two fervent women's suffrage supporters, and it was attended by Frederick Douglass, At the convention, the people who gathered, men and women, discussed the issues relating to women's rights, not just suffrage, but other legal issues affecting women. And they wrote up a declaration of sentiments putting out the demands that women had. And among the demands was women's suffrage. The Declaration of Sentiments is written in the style of a Declaration of Independence. So it clearly was, the authors are making a nod to the Declaration of Independence. So because of this formal gathering and the fact that there was a declaration asking for women's suffrage, 1848 is often marked as the beginning of the women's suffrage movement. But we can be certain that there were individual women who advocated for women's suffrage long before that. And one of the issues in our historical research is many of the women who were suffrage advocates are actually unknown. We are still learning more. So if we set the start of the women's suffrage movement at 1848, we can see how long and for how many years suffragists had to work before they achieved women's suffrage. Essentially, a 70 plus year struggle, a little bit shorter in some states, but overall, a 70-year struggle until the 19th Amendment was passed or went into effect in 1920. And I think it's important to appreciate this that some of the early leaders, like Susan B. Anthony, died before they saw the dawn of women's suffrage. And the women kept going, kept fighting, kept organizing, and over time made some small inroads. But the majority of those 70 years were really disappointment after disappointment. So we can see in the images that follow, suffragists were trying to think of creative ways to influence the public and to change public opinion about women's suffrage. And I believe that these images played a key role in getting the message out to people who maybe hadn't thought about women's suffrage or maybe were against it. But they were one of the ways that the suffragists could influence others and garner support for the movement. In Michigan, women got the vote a little bit earlier than some other women did. So I'm going to just briefly talk about Michigan. In Michigan, when we talk about the struggle and the defeat after defeat, Michigan women worked on 3 different ballot initiatives that were approved by the legislature and were put to the public, meaning men, for a vote. And they were all defeated. The first one was in 1874, then there was one in 1912, and then in 1913. But finally, in 1918, the Michigan voters passed an amendment to our Michigan Constitution providing that women had the right to vote. And of course, women got full suffrage then 2 years later when the US Constitution was amended. To give a little bit more context of the period of time where most of our images are from, I'm really trying to set the stage so you can see what was going on at that particular time. This is a map from late 1912. On the left, we have the states where women can vote. So it's 1912, and there's still only, there are 5 states on the left where women were given suffrage, and then 4 states on the right where women just very recently got suffrage. The earning of suffrage was because of individual campaigns in those states. So another point I'd like to make is that the suffrage movement was centralized to a certain extent, but the state groups were well organized and they operated independent of NASA, although they coordinated activities with NASA. And so it was a partnership, but was really robust organizing at the local level. And notice when you look at the map, the divisions between different areas of the country. For the most part, we see that in the Western states in red, women had full voting rights. And then in black, mostly Southern states where women had absolutely no voting rights at all. In between there are the shaded states where women had some partial voting rights. For example, in Michigan, women earned the right to vote in school elections in 1867 if they owned property. And then in 1881, that right was extended, the right to vote in school elections was extended to mothers who had children in school. And just as a side note, because women could vote in school elections in Michigan, it meant they could also run for school boards way before they could actually vote or run for other types of positions. And some of the first elected positions women had were on school boards. And now let's move on and look at a couple of postcards that featured suffrage leaders. I'm not by any means going to try to talk about all the suffrage leaders, but just a few, and to show how postcards of the leaders were used as sometimes a way to make money or simply a way to advertise the cause. This one is obviously Susan B. Anthony, and it was used by the Detroit Equal Suffrage Association um, to, excuse me, it's a Detroit Equality Suffrage Club. It was used as an invitation card to one of their events. This particular one is owned by the Detroit Historical Society, and it was addressed to Dr. Gertrude Banks, who was well known in Michigan as one of the first, and in Detroit, as one of the first women to attend the University of Michigan Medical School. And she was just the second female doctor to practice in Detroit. She was also a friend of Susan B. Anthony and was very active in the suffrage movement. And another key leader, of course, was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And she was known as a writer and theorist of the movement, and her ideas clearly appear in the Declaration of Sentiments from Seneca Falls. She wrote a history of the women's suffrage movement with Susan B. Anthony. And they each had slightly different roles. Susan B. Anthony traveled extensively to different states to try to support state efforts to amend their constitutions. Uh, Elizabeth Cady Stanton had a large family and was not as free to travel, yet she was really a brilliant thinker. And she provided a lot of the ideas that underlay the movement. And I'm going to move on now to one of the younger leaders. Because of the length of time that we're talking about, the we had a whole another generation of women come into the movement and participate in it after the original leaders. At this point in time, and when this picture was taken, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were not even alive anymore. They both died in the first decade of the 1900s. So we're looking at Alice Paul, and just as an example, she's about 60 years younger than Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She had worked in the suffrage movement in England and was very influenced by the women there and by the tactics they used. And we'll see a little later how she ended up disagreeing with some of the older suffragists about what direction the movement should take in the United States. I love this picture because it really operates on two levels. One is just shows you a picture of Alice Paul, but I think the story behind the picture is really wonderful. This shows Alice Paul sewing a star on a flag. The flag was created after the 19th Amendment was ratified by Congress and was sent to the states for ratification. Three-fourths of the states needed to support the 19th Amendment in order for it to go into law. Alice Paul is shown here sewing a flag, excuse me, a star on that flag as progress was made towards ratification of the 19th Amendment. And it's a great visual representation of progress or lack of progress in moving towards ratification of the 19th Amendment. After the 19th Amendment was ratified by Tennessee, the 36th state, Paul unfurled the banner off the balcony of the headquarters of the National Women's Party, a party that she had founded, in a very dramatic move. When I look at this picture, I see just the heritage of the types of visual effects that suffragists were using, the drama, and eye-catching uh, kind of events and even images that they created. And I'd like to talk about one other suffrage leader because she played a very unique role in the movement um, and brought to it a background that was somewhat different from some of the other suffrage leaders. This is Ida B. Wells Barnett. She was a journalist and civil rights activist. As a journalist, she documented lynchings of Black men and women in the South and elsewhere, and she was a driving force behind the anti-lynching movement. In her work, she documented the extent of the problem of lynching of vulnerable men and women, and then she mobilized people and tried to get the public outcry against lynching. So you can see she was someone who was an advocate who wasn't afraid to challenge what was going on and also to use her writing skills to challenge the status quo. Within the suffrage movement, she also spoke out about racism. And one of the examples of her speaking out was when women, or excuse me, Blacks were excluded from the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Ida B. Wells wrote a pamphlet detailing what had happened and arguing why the achievements of Black people should have been fully represented and why Black people should have been represented in the planning of the Columbian Exposition. We'll see her later on. We'll talk about her a little bit more later on when we talk about some of the suffrage activities. Now I'm going to change topics a little bit, and I'm grouping the images I'm showing you by themes, and you'll see we're going to jump back and forth a little bit in terms of dates. Um, but in this segment, I'm going to keep things in order of dates. So I'd like to show you some postcards of parades that took place during the suffrage movement. And we'll start at home in Grand Rapids. I see that I listed the Michigan State Fair. I'm not going to show that. Um, so we'll start here in Grand Rapids in 1910. These are all postcards, what I'm going to show you. And they're a type of postcard called real photo postcards, or for the most part they are, and which are photos taking an event that individual people could have developed. And so these postcards really document key events. This photo, I think, is striking because of the design of the float. It was covered in white lilies. We have the young women in white with their hats. And the more that I look at it, the more things I see in the picture. And I can just imagine all those people peering at the float, what they were thinking and feeling as they saw it go by. Uh, the float was part of the homecoming parade in Grand Rapids on August 26, 1910. And if you look very closely, you'll see um, Justice, played by Margaret McKee, enthroned at the back, and she's holding the scales of justice and also has a blindfold on, representing justice is blind. And also, one of the women at the reins is suffragist Eva McCall Hamilton. She was the first state senator from our area, and actually the first state senator in Michigan. And she was elected in 1920, so very soon after women got the right to vote. And she served from 1921 to 1922. A woman did not hold that seat again until 2018, when current Senate Majority Leader Winnie Brinks was elected from the district in the Grand Rapids area. So it's really remarkable. And also, um, certainly, we could have a whole separate presentation on the evolution of women in politics in the years after women got the right to vote. But I simply love the drama of this, and I think that's what parades offered. And we'll see in some of the later images other ways that suffragists use drama. Suffrage was often a family affair, and you're looking here at Aldi Blake, who was one of our key suffrage leaders. This photo of her is actually from a national suffrage magazine, the Woman Citizen. And her four daughters are on the right: Dorothy, Barbara, Isabel, and Ethel. During the parade, the Blake daughters rode on the float with the other suffragists dressed in white. They were much younger when this picture was taken. And her mother and other leading suffragists followed behind in cars. So I think it's wonderful to see how whole families got together and were involved. Now we're going to switch to the national level, and we're going to look at pictures of the March on Washington March in Washington that took place on March 3, 1913. This is reported to be the first civil rights parade to use the Capitol as a backdrop. And it was a major gathering of marchers. It's estimated that there were about 5,000 marchers and 500,000 people in attendance. The parade was organized by Alice Paul, who we met earlier. At that point, she had returned from England in 1910, and she was chair of the NASA Congressional Committee, the purpose of that committee was to get Congress to pass the amendment giving women the right to vote. And really that was Alice Paul's focus, was getting the US Constitution changed to prevent women from being barred at the polls. And this is the full program for the procession. The procession itself was very carefully organized, and there were delegations. Women would march with their delegation. We had delegations from different countries where women could vote, and then delegations by state. There were delegations of different groups of women who had gone to college, so they were grouped by affiliation. And we'll now look at some of the images from that day. First, the suffrage parade was led by Inez Milholland on a white horse. She was the herald leading the way. And when I look at this, I just think about the effect this would have had on the public watching it. And you can see the people that are just jammed in, trying to see everything. Then, as the parade continues, this is one of the sections of marchers. You can see that they have carefully coordinated white outfits. Um, it says National Woman Suffrage Association in the beginning sign. I haven't been able to identify exactly where in the parade this was, but it gives you some example of what the parade procession itself looked like. And if we had time to look at more photos, you'd see how each group had its own interpretation of the costume of the day. So there are really a lot of creative ideas about dress and how to create a sense of drama during the parade. During the parade, or at the start of the parade, there was a kind of ugly incident where Black women were asked to go to the back of the parade. Many Black women were involved with their state organizations, and so would normally be marching with their own state organizations. And Ida B. Wells Barnett, who we met earlier, objected strenuously to this and insisted that she march with her own Chicago delegation. This is widely reported, and I wanted to make sure to include that just because the suffragists were walking a line between trying not to alienate the southern states, which were not open at all to women's suffrage. And so suffrage leaders made some real moral and ethical compromises. Um, you could, essentially that were racist, that were choosing the rights of white women over the rights of Black women who were trying to earn the vote. So the movement was not always united on that score. Now, that's a side note. Let's continue with the parade. Um, Along the route of the parade, on the steps of the Treasury Department, there was a little tableau um, featuring Justice, Lady Justice. And I'll show you a close-up of Lady Justice, or excuse me, Liberty, not Justice, Liberty and her attendants from that tableau. In this photo, Lady Liberty's dress is really evokes to me classical kind of dress, and I see similar kind of draping in other images that we'll look at later. The parade was not totally harmonious, and in the course of the parade, onlookers burst through the barricades and essentially halted the parade and roughed up some of the suffrage advocates, um, and were rowdy, and the the police really lost control of the parade. And there were some reports that the police just stood by when this happened and did nothing. And it became an incident that was reported widely in the news after the parade. It kept the parade in the public view for weeks and weeks and weeks. as there was an investigation into what had happened and how this had come to be and why the police couldn't prevent it and why there wasn't more done to protect the marchers. I've read some accounts of the parade, and apparently, because the parade was so long, there were some marchers who weren't really even aware that this was going on at the time that it happened. Um, but it became an incident that, while it was ugly, um, in a way, furthered the cause in the sense of getting more attention to the parade. And I'd like to now jump a few years later. Now it's, excuse me, I should have mentioned that the 1913 parade, the date was chosen because it was on the eve of Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. And he was refusing to endorse women's suffrage at that time. After the parade, Alice Paul broke from NASA and formed her own suffrage organization called the Congressional Union. That later became the National Women's Party. And she broke with the organization really over two issues. One was she was laser focused on getting an amendment to the US Constitution. She was not interested in working on a state by state approach to getting women's suffrage. And in fact, that never would have worked because there were states where um, the legislatures would never vote to give women the right to vote. And she also favored more militant tactics. And so what you see here is during Woodrow Wilson's presidency in 1917, Alice Paul organized pickets in front of the White House. And they had banners saying, Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage? And so really it was a direct confrontation of of President Wilson, really taking it to the gates of his home. And this picketing was frowned on by some suffragists because they thought it was just too radical, and um, women were especially concerned about suffragists being accused of being unpatriotic. And so this was very controversial, and it's an example of Alice Paul just, with her party taking a step forward that other suffragists were not willing to do. Over 2,000 women came from around the country to serve as silent sentinels at the gates of the White House, and 500 of the women were arrested, and many of them were sent to the Occoquan workhouse in the District of Columbia area, where they endured miserable conditions and abuse from the guards. The picketing drew great attention in the media, and eventually, and not after only a year, um, Woodrow Wilson endorsed women's suffrage when he ran for reelection in 1918. So the silent sentinels were really one of the very important events in the women's suffrage movement, as was the 1913 parade in the District of Columbia. These are a few examples, but during this last decade, and especially when states were having their own suffrage referenda coming up for a vote, parades were widely used as a way to get the message out. Now we're going to take a look at images that appeared in newspapers and magazines. I have a few from the Grand Rapids Press and a few from national publications. Let's start with the Grand Rapids Press. About a year after the suffrage parade in Washington, suffrage organizations were looking for different ways to keep the momentum going, um, to get their word out. And NASA called for a day of suffrage events to be held around the country. The day that they chose was May 2, 1914. And the Grand Rapids Equal Suffrage League was eager to participate in that. The Grand Rapids suffragists organized a rally at Fulton Street Park. And also, they convinced the editor of the Grand Rapids Press to let them produce a full issue of the Grand Rapids Press written by suffragists and devoted both to suffrage and to uh, achievements of women in other areas like business and athletics. The leaders of the suffrage organization served as editors for different pages, and together they produced a full edition of the Grand Rapids Press. We're going to look at a few images from the Grand Rapids Press, and if you have any, if if this has piqued your interest at all, I really encourage you to look at the whole edition because it's just absolutely remarkable. But now we're going to look at some illustrations in that are supporting the claim for suffrage. This one I find really fascinating because at first glance, you may not get the message, but if you look closely, it on the side of the women who are marching is the name of the states where women could vote at that time. So we've got Colorado, Utah, Idaho, Oregon, etc. And then at the very back of the line is Michigan. We have a woman whose hands are chained. And the caption is, with, but not of, the sisterhood of states that have secured equal suffrage, walks Michigan, still shackled. A very powerful image. Also, in the same issue, um, was a cartoon drawing with looks like some photocopies from photos of prominent men in Grand Rapids and their position on suffrage. We're looking here at a collection of men who had stature in the community, from judges, city officials, and then there are three business people who are represented. Um, Percival B. Garvey, Robert E. Shanahan, and J. Boyd Pantlin. When we take a look, we can see that Ralph Mosier, who was a city clerk, he's on the other side of the fence. He's anti-suffrage. And then we have four men straddling the fence, not really taking a position one way or the other, dodging the question. And that included entrepreneur and hotel owner J. Boyd Pantlin. This was before he had built the Pantlin Hotel. In the front, our pro-suffrage people are Percival B. Garvey and Robert E. Shanahan. It's no coincidence that Shanahan and Garvey are pro-suffrage because both of their wives were active in the suffrage movement. So I said before that suffrage was almost often a family affair. Well, it certainly was in those two families. Robert E. Shanahan's wife, Mary Ellen, is much better known, and she was the managing. She's much better known as a suffragist. She was the managing editor of this suffrage edition. Um, Percival B. Garvey's wife, and I'm sorry that I don't have her first name, um, isn't as well known, and I really had to do some digging and found her name as a woman who had signed up to speak in favor of suffrage, to go around and to speak at different meetings. And so I was glad to be able to document her participation in the movement. This I view as really taking it to the local establishment and saying, "Hey, when are you going to get off the fence? this is, you've got to uh, either be with us or be against us. Another image from the front page was this drawing that says, "Her world, a strange new world, a woman's world, has risen out of the void." And the feeling from this image appears in other suffrage media of that woman's time has really arrived, and she's really ready to have full participation in, government and in all aspects of her life. Now we're going to look at a national magazine, Puck magazine. This illustration is by Hy Mayer, Mayer, um, in February 20th, 1915. Puck was a humor magazine that was known for political commentary that was conveyed through cartoons and caricatures. The magazine generally featured anti-suffrage content, but it reversed course, and during a campaign for women's suffrage in New York in 1915, published a special pro-suffrage issue um, with this image as a centerfold. This is one of my favorite illustrations among the ones that we're looking at today. I think it's so evocative. Uh, we have um, justice, liberty walking forward from the Western states where women can vote. And there's just a sea of women in the Eastern states appealing, for help. Please come to us. And I think it really it appeals to both the intellect and the emotions. You can really see the unfairness of the situation, where women are battling for years and, desperate to get the vote, but they're still barred from the polls. Another national magazine, The Crisis, edited by W.E.B. Du Bois, and it was the official magazine of the NAACP, featured a suffrage issue as well. This issue that we're looking at here, this cover is from August 1915. The cover is a composite photo by Hinton Gilmore. And although this is a composite, Sojourner Truth and Abraham Lincoln did actually meet at one point. Sojourner Truth perhaps is more known as an abolitionist and more known for her early life, but she was an outspoken advocate for women's rights, is often remembered for her speech at the Women's Convention in Ohio. The speech is called the Ain't I a Woman speech. And I wanted to point out something that may not be as well known, something that happened here in Michigan. Sojourner Truth lived in Michigan in the later years of her life. And in 1872, the same year that Susan B. Anthony was arrested for voting in Rochester, Sojourner Truth went to the polls in Battle Creek and tried to vote, but was turned away. And it turns out that these two events are related because there was an effort in that year for the fall election to get women to go to the polls and to claim the right to vote on the basis that they were citizens and that they could not be denied their rights of citizenship. So it shows the extent of coordination between the national movement and people in the states. There were other women who went to the polls. Some of them actually succeeded in voting and were not prosecuted, but this is something that happened not too far from Grand Rapids that I think is important. Abraham Lincoln was often invoked as a supporter of women's suffrage, but he made very few statements on women's suffrage, and it really isn't clear whether he supported women's suffrage or not. And we'll come back to that when we look at one of the images later. And lastly, in terms of print publications, this is the cover of the Woman's Citizen, the official publication of NASA after the 19th Amendment went into effect. Suffrage won, forward march. Now we're going to turn to other postcards, and we'll be looking at both official NASA postcards as well as ones that were created by commercial publishers. And this era of suffrage memorabilia that we're talking about, the last decade or so of the suffrage movement, also coincided with a change in the regulations on sending postcards. And before 1907, you could not write on the address side of the postcard, so communication was limited. Um, and in in 1907, women could write on the back, or excuse me, people could write on the back. So it made sending postcards much more attractive. In 1910, NASA decided that it would produce a set of its own pro-suffrage cards, and it looked around for someone who could print them. It happened that the year before, tariffs had been imposed, and cards that had been previously printed overseas because of the quality of the engraving and printing overseas were now much more expensive. So NASA looked to find a new printer for their cards. They wanted a very high quality product, and they settled on the Cargill Company in Grand Rapids. We see here an image of the Cargill Company plant that was on the corner of Wealthy and Commerce, and also Charles Cargill, the president of the company. These cards, and I'll go right to the first one I want to show you. These cards were sold by NASA to raise money, and of course, also just to get the word out about the suffrage movement. There was a set of 30 cards, and there are quite a few of them in existence because so many of them were printed. The Grand Rapids Public Library, I believe, has either finished completing its set or is very close to getting its set of cards, 30 altogether. I'm going to show you a few cards from early in the run of cards and then from the end of the run, and you'll see that there's some stylistic differences in the later part of the year with the last few cards that were generated. The early cards were very much a cerebral appeal to fairness, or they addressed arguments that were made against women's suffrage. In this case, will women be forced to vote if granted the right of suffrage? Is man disenfranchised for not exercising this right? Do not be misled. Essentially, this is addressing the argument that women really don't want to vote and they'll have to vote. We don't want to force women to vote, but of course, men were not forced to vote. So this is pointing out that inconsistency. Another one of the earlier cards, and here we can see some of the other features a little more clearly. Equal suffrage is neither more nor less than simple justice. A very forward way of making the argument. All of the cards had this emblem on it. The ballot is denied to women, the blot on the escutcheon. And that conveys that there's a stain on our national reputation as long as we are denying women the right to vote. I would say that this image probably wouldn't have the same impact today because people wouldn't really understand it or understand all the connotations. But this was an image and saying that NASA felt was important. It's more or less saying shame on you for not giving women the right to vote. And then across the bottom in a banner, we'll see on the cards, an ounce of persuasion precedes a pound of coercion. A pretty strong statement. The cards at the end of the run of 30 used images more effectively. So this one, now we've got a suffrage banner, and simply equal suffrage is the birthright of women. And then the last two, we have a blown up version of the blot on the escutcheon, and then also an image of Abraham Lincoln with what's purportedly a quote that says, I go for all sharing the privileges of the government who assist in bearing its burdens, by no means excluding women. I did a little bit of reading about the significance of Abraham Lincoln to suffragists, and it appears that he was widely invoked, I think, as a symbol of civil rights, equality. But in terms of this quote, which was used in many places by suffragists, it turns out that there's something missing from this quotation. And what was left out was um, the phrase, consequently, I go for admitting all whites to the right of suffrage who pay taxes or bear arms. So, really, the meaning of what Lincoln said in 1836 when he made this statement has been altered. And really, he had qualified the statement to say that he was only, supporting sharing of privileges among people who pay taxes or bore arms. And certainly the people who bore arms would not be including women. There's disagreement about whether Abraham Lincoln actually did support women's suffrage or not, and also disagreement about this quote and its significance. But I thought it was interesting that it's slightly edited and perhaps uh, a little bit misleading in terms of what was originally intended by Abraham Lincoln. Now we're going to look at more images, and you'll see here these are mainly postcards, but there are a few posters and other images. This is where I got my title from, and we'll see how they tie into other themes of the suffrage movement, either pro or anti. This one, give mother the vote. Our food, our health, our play, our homes, our schools, our work are all regulated by men's votes. Think it over and give mother the vote. This is representing one key argument made by suffragists, which is that women had important responsibilities at home. They were raising the nation's children, and that women should have a say in the quality of their food, their schools, anything that was affecting their children. And a very clever postcard along this theme. Politics governs even the purity of the milk supply. It is not outside the home, but inside the baby. A quote from Charlotte Perkins Gilman. This is getting at the argument that women shouldn't be involved in politics or other affairs outside of the home. And Gilman is making the point that politics enter the home, And you really can't keep them out because many aspects of our daily life, and especially for raising children, are affected by what's happening on the political realm. And then the point is that women then should have a say. If they're going to be in charge of raising families, they should have a say in political issues that affect the welfare of families. I sticking with the mother theme. This is another image I found that I loved, and also I just love that someone created not someone, Alfred Bryan and Herman Paley created sheet music with a suffrage song. She's good enough to be your baby's mother, and she's good enough to vote with you. And this shows how the suffrage movement had really penetrated popular culture and was represented in many different artistic forms. Another favorite image, it was used in posters and postcards, was the Kewpie image. The one on the left says after Rose O'Neill, who was a well-known artist who did a lot of work for NASA. This one, do I get your vote? And then the next one, also by the Campbell Art Company, let's pull together. This is taking a little bit more gentle approach instead of kind of threatening coercion or calling people to task for not supporting suffrage. And really, in these postcards, what I start to see is um, just tugging at the heartstrings, having cute kids, using images that are known to people, like the Kewpie image, and using that as a way to get their attention. On the anti side, a company called the Dunstan Weiler Lithograph Company of New York produced a 12 card set of full color lithographic cartoon postcards opposing women's suffrage. These are two of the cards. They're very striking for their design. And if we look at them a little more closely, we can see what the artwork is conveying um, with the text and the images. Where, oh, where is my wandering wife tonight? And of course, the wife has left the husband at home with the crying children, and she's run off to some kind of political meeting because she's now running the government and has lost interest in what is going on at home. So this is portraying suffrage as the great disruptor of families and destroyer of family harmony. On the right is the suffragette Madonna. And the word suffragette was not used in the United States, or the suffragists did not use it themselves. The term suffragist is accurate. So the suffragette term has a pejorative quality to it. So we have the Madonna with the halo holding the baby. And this shows another strain of the cards of women or men being feminized. That the women have taken over the men's roles, and now the masculine identity has been stripped because the men are home with the kids. So these I think are very um, important visual statements, or very much attract your eye and use beautiful colors, and just show another way in which the messages were conveyed. And certainly there were plenty of anti-suffrage messages that were conveyed over the course of the movement. A few more things just for fun. If we're going to have babies in images, we're going to have animals. This one, I'm a suffer yet. Our poor weary suffragist who has some battle wounds is just hanging in there and just trying to keep chugging along and trotting along towards the goal, but accumulating a lot of damage along the way. We have to have equal time for cats if we're going to have dogs. So we cats were used also, and I think that these are both really adorable. Um, Votes for women, we demand the vote. I want my vote. You can almost hear the meow coming out of the cat's mouth. And on the left, we see suffrage colors and, well, actually, both cards, we see suffrage colors. Cards were also created, postcards for the holidays, for virtually, well, for a number of major holidays. This one was one of the most popular of all the cards that was created. Votes for Women, Merry Christmas. And the design was reproduced in many forms, including on Christmas stockings, with good reason. I have to thank Christine Byron for sharing this image with me. I don't think I would have been aware of it, but it's a lovely image. And of course, Valentine's Day really lends itself to suffrage cartoons. Um, Here we have the little girl saying "My hero" as the little boy marches for votes for women with his sign. This is just one example. There are many, many Valentines that are created. And just another sampling. Um, these are by the artist Ellen Clapsaddle, and they're commercial cards printed by Wolf and Company. That she has a very distinctive artistic style. In this case, I wanted to show how an individual artist might do cards both for and against suffrage. So one is women's spheres in the home. Women should be at home, shouldn't be voting. And then the other one is love me, love my vote. We're going to finish now with a series of images that I've chosen just because I think the images themselves are so powerful and I really love these images. And this is possibly my favorite out of all of them. It comes from initially from England. It's a 1909 poster that is called Handicapped, and it's from a contest held by the Artists Suffrage League in London. The the poster was admired so much that NASA got the rights to reprint it and publish it in the United States. So in the poster, we see a man just breezing along in his sailboat, no problem, while the woman below him is struggling at the oars, a huge wave about to come crashing down on her. And if there ever is an illustration that really captures the suffrage movement, I think this is it. Essentially, the uphill battle that women were fighting to get women's suffrage. This image was created by artist Bertha Margaret Boy, a faculty member at the California School of Arts and Crafts, for a contest in San Francisco that was sponsored in 1911 by the College Equal Suffrage League. The poster won the competition, and it the images have been widely reproduced in other forms. Um, and this particular version of her design is from 1913. So it's not the original design. It's from a couple years later. And it at first, when I looked at it, it wasn't clear to me what the orange in the background represented. But in doing some research, apparently the orange is the sun rising behind the Gate Bridge in San Francisco. The appearance of the poster was Art Deco to me, but this actually was a little bit before the Art Deco period. So I I'm not an expert on art, so I can't, I can't label this design, but I think it's very beautiful. This is an official postcard from 1915, published by NASA, and this has beautiful illustration, and it has been identified as one that emphasizes the femininity of suffragists. And because that was always a fine line that suffragists were walking was, not to appear too masculine. Even the image of Alice Paul sewing the stars on the flag, that was a, traditional feminine thing to be doing. And I think you could interpret this in a lot of ways. Are you seeing, is she just pondering? Is she weary? But the draping and her dress, do suggest femininity. NASA published other cards in this similar style, also in 1915. I'm going to finish with two images from closer to home. I don't think the presentation would be complete without them. Um, One is a poster that was distributed in Grand Rapids in 1919 by the Americanization Society. The Americanization Society had been formed to educate immigrants on their role as citizens in the United States and also to get people to register to vote. And they had a very well organized registration campaign that was going among men, and it was very effective. When women got the right to vote in Michigan in 1918, they simply added women into the equation. The poster that you're looking at, first of all, I wanted to acknowledge the Grand Rapids Public Museum because they have this original poster um, that it was given to women as they registered to vote in 1919, and they were asked to display it in their window before the 1919 primary, which in March 1919, that would have been the first time that women could vote in elections other than school elections or um, a few women could vote in taxpaying women could vote in municipal elections that involved um, taxation or raising money a little bit before that too. Um, this uh, poster then would be put in the window so it would make a dramatic display of the number of women who had registered to vote and who wanted to vote and who were not letting any time pass before they exercised the right to vote. It's been reproduced in many forms, and I had a friend who just sent me a dish towel with this image on it. So it's actually been seized on, and there's a lot of contemporary versions drawn from this image. And I'm going to rejoin you now as I close the presentation. Um, the last image is of suffragist Minnie Mickle. This image is held by the Grand Rapids History Center, and it was donated to the History Center by his historian Richard Harms and his wife Joan. Minnie Mickle, the woman represented here, was Joan's great, um, no, excuse me. Um, Minnie was Joan's great grandmother. And we really know very little about this image. It was rescued from a box of items that were going to be sold at a garage sale. So we're still doing research to find out more about Mini Micklin, where this photo was taken. Um, the library was contacted several years ago by the museum because it wanted to use the image in its materials on suffrage. Thank you very much for joining me today, and I hope I haven't overwhelmed with all the images and the information. If you would like to learn more about the women's suffrage movement, please check out the Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council website. We have a whole photo essay on the Grand Rapids and Michigan suffrage movements. It has content that you won't find elsewhere at all. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me through GGRWHC. Thank you.